The sharp screech of metal against rock echoed through the cabin as Mark Solis gripped the controls of his failing shuttle. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and the ship trembled violently as it pierced the planet's dense atmosphere. The computer's voice warned of imminent impact, but Mark's focus stayed on the cracked display in front of him. He wasn't ready to die, not on some uncharted planet he was forced to divert to after an engine malfunction. "Hold together," he muttered, though it felt more like a plea than a command. Moments later, the ship crashed through a canopy of massive trees, branches snapping like brittle bones. With a deafening thud, it slammed into the soft jungle floor, carving a trench before finally coming to rest. Smoke billowed from the wreckage as Mark unbuckled his harness, wincing at the ache in his shoulders. "Well," he said to himself, brushing off debris. "Still breathing. That's a start." The outside world was a cacophony of alien sounds, chirps, growls, and the occasional distant roar. Mark grabbed a toolkit and his portable scanner, knowing survival meant repairing the shuttle before anything decided he looked like lunch. As he stepped out, the jungle greeted him with humid air thick enough to taste. Towering trees with glowing veins stretched endlessly upward, their leaves shimmering faintly like stars. The ground was covered in moss that squelched beneath his boots, and strange flowers pulsed with light, as though they had their own heartbeat. "This place is alive," Mark murmured, both awestruck and wary. His scanner beeped incessantly, struggling to identify the abundant life forms surrounding him. He spent hours assessing the shuttle, which looked worse than he'd hoped. The power core was fried, and spare parts were limited. With no distress signal sent before the crash, rescue wasn't coming. Just as he began dismantling a damaged panel, the feeling struck, like eyes boring into his back. Mark froze, his instincts honed from years on alien worlds telling him he wasn't alone. Slowly, he turned, scanning the jungle's shadows. Nothing moved. Then, a voice, not from his comms, not from his ship, but crystal clear and impossibly close. "You shouldn't be here." Mark spun around, his pulse racing. A figure stepped out from the thick foliage, and he felt his breath hitch. She was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Her skin shimmered like molten silver, and her eyes glowed with an ethereal violet hue that seemed to pierce right through him. Her tall, slender frame exuded a mix of grace and power, as if the jungle itself bowed to her presence. A faint hum of energy seemed to radiate around her, making the air feel charged. Mark instinctively raised his wrench, though it felt laughable as a weapon. "What are you?" he demanded, keeping his voice steady despite his pounding heart. The woman tilted her head, as though amused by his attempt at defiance. "You won't leave," she said simply. Mark blinked, confused. "What do you mean, I won't leave?" "My shuttle's wrecked, yes, but I'll fix it. I just need time." She took a step closer, her movements fluid and deliberate. "No," she said, her tone unyielding. "You cannot leave. Not yet." Mark tightened his grip on the wrench. "Listen, lady, I don't know who you are or what you want, but I'm not staying on this planet. So unless you're planning to help, I suggest you stay out of my way." Her violet eyes narrowed, and the hum around her grew louder, more intense. Before Mark could react, a tendril of energy burst from her hand, slamming into a nearby tree. The massive trunk split cleanly in two, crashing to the ground with a thunderous roar. Mark stared at the smoking remains of the tree, then back at her. The wrench dropped from his hand. "Okay," he said slowly. "You've got my attention." The woman studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You're important," she said finally. "Too important to lose. The universe has plans for you, human." Mark frowned, struggling to process her cryptic words. What does that even mean? "Who are you? Why do you care what happens to me?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and began walking away, pausing only to glance over her shoulder. "Follow me, or you won't survive the night." Mark hesitated, his mind racing with questions and doubts. But as the jungle's distant growls grew louder, closer, he realized he didn't have much of a choice. Grabbing his pack, he followed her into the shadows, each step pulling him deeper into a mystery he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. Mark kept a cautious distance as he followed the strange woman through the dense jungle. Her footsteps were silent, almost as if she was part of the shadows. He struggled to keep up with her pace, dodging strange plants and avoiding the thick vines that seemed to reach for him. The deeper they went, the more the jungle seemed to change. The trees were enormous now, their trunks twisting into spirals like ancient sentinels. Strange, glowing creatures flitted between the branches, their wings flickering with iridescent light. Mark couldn't help but stare at the strange beauty of the place, but the feeling of unease never quite left him. Finally, after what felt like hours, they arrived at a clearing. The woman stopped in the center and turned to face Mark, her eyes glowing brighter in the darkening twilight. "This is where you'll be safe for the moment," she said, her voice calm but firm. Mark surveyed the area. The clearing was surrounded by thick vegetation, and it was eerily quiet. The strange creatures he'd seen earlier now seemed to keep their distance. The air had a cool, almost soothing quality, but the feeling of being watched never left him. He crossed his arms, his suspicion growing. Safe? From what? Her gaze softened, though her expression remained unreadable. From the creatures that hunt here, and from yourself. Mark frowned. What's that supposed to mean? She didn't answer immediately, instead turning to a nearby tree. She placed her hand on the bark, and a faint pulse of light spread from her fingers, causing the tree's leaves to glow softly. "It's better if you don't know everything right away," she said, her voice distant. "But I'll explain what I can. You need to understand why I'm here." Mark crossed his arms. He was tired, frustrated, and confused, but there was something about her presence that made him want to listen. She didn't seem like a threat, at least not in the way the other dangers of the planet had. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on. "All right," he said finally, "but you owe me some answers." She nodded, as if expecting his response. "I am Ceres," she began. "I am not from this world. My people, we were once great. We traveled the stars, shaped entire worlds with our knowledge, and lived in harmony. But that was long ago." Mark's curiosity piqued. What happened? Ceres's eyes darkened, her gaze drifting to the stars above. A war that destroyed everything. Our species, we are no longer what we were. We are dying. Mark blinked. Wait a second. You're saying you're from another planet, and you're immortal. Her lips curled into a slight smile, though there was sadness in her eyes. Yes, I am immortal, but it is not a gift. It is a curse. Immortal. Mark repeated, the word heavy in his mind. He had met many strange beings in his travels, but none who seemed as otherworldly as Ceres. "But why am I here?" Mark asked, frustrated by the lack of answers. "You said I couldn't leave, but I don't even know who you are, or why I matter." Ceres's gaze softened again, and she stepped closer to him. "You are important, Mark Solis, more important than you realize. You are the key to saving my people." Mark's mind spun. How am I the key? I'm just a regular engineer. I don't have some kind of magic, or whatever it is you think I can do. Ceres met his eyes. Your species has something we do not. Genetic diversity. My people's bloodline has become too pure, too stagnant over the centuries. We cannot reproduce. The few of us left are all we have. But your kind has the answer. Mark shook his head in disbelief. "Wait, so you're saying that you need my DNA to fix whatever happened to your people?" "Yes," Ceres said, her voice unwavering. "Only humans have the genetic potential to help us. But it is not just any human. It is you, Mark Solis." He stepped back, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "I still don't get it. Why me? What makes me so special?" Cirrus paused, her expression thoughtful. There is a rare combination of traits within your genetic code. Traits that could revitalize my people. You don't understand yet, but you will. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. This was more than he could process. How could he be the answer to a problem so vast? He was just a man who fixed broken ships and kept to himself. How could he possibly save an entire species? Before he could voice his thoughts, the air around them seemed to shift. A strange, high-pitched sound rang through the clearing. Mark's instincts kicked in, and he turned toward the noise. Cirrus immediately tensed. "We are not alone," she said in a low voice. "Stay close." Mark barely had time to react as creatures, dark and shadowy, emerged from the jungle, their glowing eyes fixed on them. Cirrus stepped forward, her energy pulsing with power. "Stay behind me," she ordered. Mark did as told, heart racing as the creatures drew closer. There was no time to question her any longer. He was caught in something bigger than himself, and now he had to survive. Mark's heart raced as the shadowy creatures circled the clearing. They were taller than humans, their long limbs stretching unnaturally. Their bodies were cloaked in dark fur, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness around them. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. There were at least 6 of them, and he knew he was no match. Cirrus didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her hand raised. A faint hum filled the air, and the creatures froze, as if an invisible barrier surrounded them. Mark could barely see it, but he could feel the energy gathering around Cirrus, a powerful force that made the air vibrate. "Stay behind me," she commanded, her voice low and steady. Her eyes were focused on the creatures, her expression calm but alert. Mark took a deep breath and did as she said, stepping back. He watched in awe as Cirrus' energy seemed to glow brighter. She extended her hand toward the nearest creature, and the air crackled with power. The creature snarled but did not move. It was trapped. "You are not welcome here." Cirrus spoke in a language Mark couldn't understand, though the tone was harsh and commanding. The creatures responded with deep, guttural growls, their glowing eyes narrowing in challenge. Mark couldn't help but wonder what she was doing. She wasn't just protecting them. She was controlling them, keeping them at bay with nothing more than the force of her will. He had never seen anything like it. After a tense moment, one of the creatures stepped back, its glowing eyes still fixed on Cirrus. The others followed suit, retreating slowly into the jungle. Mark let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. They were gone, but the air still hummed with tension. Cirrus lowered her hand, and the energy around her began to fade. She turned to Mark, her expression softening. "They won't bother us anymore," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But we are not safe here for long. We must move." Mark still couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. You just control them." "How?" he asked, trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. Cirrus looked at him, her violet eyes glimmering in the fading light. "It's not control," she said quietly. "It's protection. My people have abilities that allow us to influence the world around us. But it's not something I take lightly. I use it only when necessary." Mark shook his head. "But why didn't you tell me this before? You're not just some lost traveler, are you? You're something else." Cirrus didn't answer immediately. She looked out into the jungle, as if searching for something beyond the trees. Then, with a sigh, she spoke. "I have lived for thousands of years, Mark. I have seen entire civilizations rise and fall, watched stars burn out and die. But in all that time, I have never found peace." Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. There was a sadness in her voice, something ancient and sorrowful that tugged at his heart. He wanted to ask more, but he didn't want to push her. After a pause, Cirrus continued, "My people, we were once part of an advanced civilization. We traveled the stars, explored countless worlds. We were powerful, and we lived in harmony with the universe. But then, a terrible war broke out." Mark listened intently, not daring to interrupt. Her words were heavy with pain, and he could feel the weight of her history in the air around them. The war destroyed everything, she continued. My people were forced to use forbidden technology to survive. We didn't understand the consequences at the time. The technology was meant to save us, but it cursed us instead. We became immortal, yes, but at a cost. Our bodies no longer age, and we can no longer reproduce. We are trapped in a never-ending cycle of life, watching everything around us wither and die. Mark stared at her in disbelief. He had never met anyone with such a tragic past, let alone someone who carried the burden of immortality. That sounds, he began, but he couldn't find the words. Service's expression darkened. It is a curse. We are trapped in time, unable to escape it, but we are not the only ones who suffer. My people's genetic code has deteriorated over thousands of years. We are a dying species, Mark. We can no longer continue on like this. Mark's mind raced. And you think I can help? You think my DNA is the answer? Cirrus turned to him, her violet eyes piercing into his soul. Yes. You, Mark Solus, are the key. Your species. You have something we do not. The genetic diversity of humanity can help my people heal, but only if we act quickly. Mark's mind whirled. He didn't know what to think. But why me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why do you think I'm the one? Cirrus hesitated for a moment before answering. Because you have a rare combination of traits within your genetic code. A combination that has the potential to unlock something powerful. Something that can save us. Mark swallowed hard. He felt like he was drowning in information. None of this made sense. He was just a regular engineer, a man who fixed broken machines. How could he possibly be the answer to something as huge as saving an entire species? Cirrus seemed to read his mind. I know this is difficult to understand, but you are not alone in this. I will help you. Together, we can find a way. Mark nodded slowly, though he still had more questions than answers. I don't know if I can do this, but I'll try. I'll help however I can. Cirrus smiled faintly, her eyes softening. That is all I ask. But as the night deepened and the sounds of the jungle grew louder, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. One that would change everything he thought he knew about himself and the universe. The night passed in uneasy silence. Mark didn't sleep much, his thoughts racing as he lay in the makeshift shelter Cirrus had created. The jungle around them felt alive, its strange creatures chirping and calling out in the dark, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. Cirrus had told him that they were safe for now, but there was something in her voice, a tension that he couldn't ignore. As the first light of dawn broke through the thick trees, Mark sat up, rubbing his eyes. He was exhausted, but there was no time to rest. The journey ahead was far from over, and he still didn't fully understand what he had gotten himself into. Cirrus was already awake, standing outside the shelter, her silver skin glowing faintly in the early morning light. She was looking out into the jungle, her posture rigid and alert. Mark hesitated for a moment before stepping out to join her. What are we doing today? Mark asked, his voice hoarse from sleep. Do you have a plan? Cirrus turned to him, her violet eyes studying him carefully. We need to get to a place where I can show you more. You still don't understand everything, but I will explain as we go. Mark nodded, though a part of him wanted more answers now. Still, he knew there was no point in pushing her. If there was one thing he had learned about Cirrus, it was that she didn't share information unless she was ready. He would have to trust her, at least for now. The two of them set off into the jungle, walking side by side. Mark noticed that Cirrus seemed completely at ease in this strange environment, moving through the thick underbrush with grace and confidence. It was as if she was part of the jungle itself. Mark, on the other hand, stumbled occasionally, tripping over vines or brushing against plants that seemed to reach out and tug at him. Despite the strange feeling of being in an alien world, there was something comforting about having Cirrus beside him. She had saved his life twice now, and shown him that she was more than just an ordinary traveler. Her powers were beyond anything he could have imagined, and yet she seemed to carry the burden of them with quiet strength. As they walked, Mark couldn't help but wonder about her past. She had mentioned a war, a lost civilization, and an immortality that was more of a curse than a gift. It was a lot to process, but he knew it wasn't the time to ask more questions. He needed to stay focused. "We're getting closer," Saris said, interrupting his thoughts. "There's a place ahead, hidden deep in the jungle. It's where I've been researching. It's where we can unlock what's inside of you." Mark frowned. "What do you mean, unlock what's inside of me? I don't feel any different. I'm still the same guy I was before I crashed here." Saris stopped and turned to him, her expression serious. "You may not feel different yet, but your DNA is changing. It's responding to this place, to me. I don't know how or why, but I know it's happening. The potential is there." Mark didn't know what to say to that. He had never been much of a believer in things like destiny or fate, but there was no denying that something strange was going on. Part of him wanted to deny it, to insist that this was all some crazy misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew that whatever was happening, it was real. As they continued, the jungle grew denser, the trees towering above them and blocking out much of the sunlight. Strange, glowing plants dotted the ground, casting an eerie light in the shadows. Mark tried not to let the unsettling atmosphere distract him, but it was hard not to feel like something was lurking just out of sight. After what felt like hours of walking, they reached a small clearing. In the center of it stood a large stone structure, overgrown with vines and moss. It looked ancient, its surface weathered by time, yet still standing strong. Mark stared at it in awe. "What is this place?" he asked. "This is where it all began," Saris replied. "This is the last place my people were able to harness the power they once had. I believe it holds the answers we need." Mark looked at the structure, feeling a sense of unease settle in his stomach. "And you think this will help me understand what's going on with me?" Saris nodded. "Yes. The energy here is connected to your genetic code. It may be the key to unlocking your potential, Mark." Mark hesitated. He was starting to feel like he was in way over his head, but there was no turning back now. He had come this far, and Saris had been right about everything so far. If she said this place could help him, he had no choice but to trust her. Saris stepped forward, reaching out to touch the surface of the stone structure. Her fingers glowed faintly as she made contact, and Mark felt a strange energy ripple through the air. "Stand back," Saris said, her voice low and focused. "This will take a moment." Mark stepped back, watching as the stone structure began to glow, faint lines of light running across its surface. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a sudden rush of energy, the stone split open, revealing a glowing crystal at the center. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "What is that?" he whispered. "That," Saris said, her voice tinged with awe, "is the source of my people's power. And it's the key to unlocking yours." Mark's eyes were fixed on the glowing crystal, which pulsed with an ethereal light. It seemed to hum softly, sending waves of energy through the air. He felt a strange pull toward it, like it was calling to him. But he also felt an overwhelming sense of caution. What was this thing, and how was it connected to him? Saris stood beside the structure, her gaze locked on the crystal. She didn't look surprised, but Mark could see the tension in her posture, the way her body seemed to vibrate with the energy in the air. "Is that the source of your people's power?" Mark asked, his voice trembling slightly. Saris nodded, but there was a depth of sadness in her eyes. "Yes, this crystal contains the essence of my people's strength. It's the heart of what we once were. But it's been dormant for centuries, until now." Mark frowned. "Until now? Why now? What's different about me?" Saris turned to him, her violet eyes meeting his. "You have something inside of you, Mark. Something that's been waiting to awaken. The crystal recognizes it. Your DNA, Your energy. Something in you has the power to activate it. Mark shook his head. I still don't get it. How could I possibly have anything like that? I'm just a regular guy. I don't have powers. Cirrus stepped closer, her expression softening. You may not realize it, but you're not as regular as you think. There's a reason the crystal reacted to you. It's because you carry the potential to change everything. Mark felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. He was just an engineer, a survivor of a crash, and now he was being told he had the potential to unlock some ancient power. It sounded impossible. Then why haven't I felt anything? Mark asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Why didn't anything happen when I first touched it? Cirrus sighed. It's not a simple process. The crystal doesn't just react to anyone. It needs time to recognize the right person. It's been waiting for someone with your specific traits, someone whose genetic makeup can unlock its true potential. Mark rubbed his temples, trying to understand. The whole situation felt like a dream, one he couldn't quite wake up from. So, what do we do now? What am I supposed to do with this power? Cirrus's expression grew serious again. You're not just here to activate the crystal. You're here to save us. The crystal can restore my people's ability to reproduce, to heal our dying race. But it needs a human, someone with the right genetics to unlock its full power. Mark stared at the crystal, a deep sense of unease settling in his chest. But I don't know how to do that. I'm not some kind of hero, Cirrus. I'm just a guy who knows how to fix things. Cirrus reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip surprisingly firm. You don't have to be a hero, Mark. You already are. Your very existence is what my people need. He shook his head again. I don't know about this. I'm not sure I can handle this kind of responsibility. What if I mess it up? Cirrus's eyes softened, and she stepped back, giving him space. The choice is yours, but I'll be with you every step of the way. You're not alone in this. Mark took a deep breath. The weight of her words hung in the air. He had never asked for any of this, but now it seemed like there was no turning back. If his blood could save her people, then maybe he had no choice but to try. He stepped forward cautiously, his hand trembling as he reached for the crystal. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a surge of energy coursed through his body. The world around him seemed to blur, and he felt an overwhelming rush of power. His heart raced, and he staggered backward, unable to process what was happening. Mark, Cirrus shouted, her voice filled with concern. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself, but the energy kept building. The crystal glowed brighter, the light seeping into his skin, flowing through his veins. It was as though every cell in his body was being awakened, charged with energy. His mind felt like it was expanding, reaching out beyond the jungle, beyond the planet, into the stars. He gasped, his breath coming in short bursts. The power was almost too much to bear. It wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional. He could feel everything. The crystal, Cirrus, the jungle around them. It was all connected. Focus, Cirrus's voice cut through the storm in his mind. You have to control it. Breathe. Let it flow through you, but don't let it consume you. Mark nodded, trying to steady his thoughts. He focused on his breath, grounding himself in the present moment. Slowly, the energy began to calm, the intensity easing. The glowing light from the crystal softened, and Mark opened his eyes. He was sweating, exhausted, but the power was still there, a quiet hum within him. Cirrus watched him closely, her expression unreadable. You've done it. The crystal has accepted you. Mark exhaled sharply, his legs feeling weak. I don't know if I can handle more of that. It felt like my entire body was on fire. Cirrus's gaze softened. It will get easier, Mark. You're only beginning to understand what you're capable of. But now we have a chance. The crystal is yours to command. Mark looked at the crystal, still glowing softly, and he realized that he had crossed a line. There was no going back now. Whatever this was, whatever power he had just unlocked, It was the key to everything. Mark could still feel the energy thrumming inside him. Faint but undeniable. It was like an extra pulse in his bloodstream, something both strange and familiar. As he stood in the clearing, his thoughts were racing. He had just tapped into something he barely understood, a power that had been dormant for centuries. The crystal had accepted him, but Mark wasn't sure he was ready for what came next. Sarah stood nearby, her eyes trained on him, waiting for him to speak. He could feel the weight of her gaze, but he wasn't sure how to explain what he was feeling. He wasn't even sure what he was feeling. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the fog of his thoughts. Mark blinked and turned to her. "I think so. It's a lot to process." Saris nodded in understanding. "I know, but you've done well. The first step is always the hardest." Mark glanced back at the crystal, which still emitted a soft, steady glow. It almost seemed alive, like it was watching him. "I don't know if I can handle all of this. It feels like it's too much. Like I'm not the right person for this." Saris stepped closer, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. "You are the right person, Mark. You're the only person who can do this. That's why the crystal chose you." Mark didn't know if he believed her. Sure, he had activated the crystal, but that didn't mean he had the answers. That didn't mean he knew how to save anyone. He was just a man, an engineer who had been stuck on a strange planet after his ship crashed. He wasn't a hero, and he didn't want to be. The weight of the responsibility was almost too much to bear. "I don't even know where to start," Mark muttered, rubbing his temples. "How am I supposed to use this power? What do I do?" Saris's expression softened. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll figure this out together." Mark looked at her, unsure. Her confidence was almost unnerving. She seemed to believe in him so completely, but he wasn't sure he could believe in himself. "I don't even know what it is. What am I supposed to save? Your people? This planet? How?" Saris turned toward the crystal again, her gaze distant. "My people are dying, Mark. We've lost everything. Our ability to reproduce, our hope, our future. The crystal can heal us, but it needs your help to do it. You are the key to unlocking the power we need." Mark felt a knot tighten in his chest. The weight of her words settled heavily on him. He had thought his life was difficult before, living alone in a broken ship on a strange planet. But now he was being told he was the answer to an entire civilization's survival. He wasn't sure if he was brave enough for that kind of responsibility. He shook his head. "How can I be the answer? I'm just me. Just one person." Saris stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was surprisingly warm, grounding him. "You are more than just one person, Mark. You're the one who can change everything. Don't doubt yourself. The crystal didn't choose you by accident." Mark looked at her, his heart heavy. "And what if I fail? What if I can't help? What if I'm not strong enough?" Saris's eyes softened with empathy. "There's no such thing as failure, not when you're doing everything you can. You've already taken the first step. That's what matters. The rest will come in time." Mark let out a shaky breath. "But what if time runs out before I figure it out?" "There's still hope," Saris said quietly. "And as long as we have hope, there is a chance." The sound of distant rustling in the jungle broke the moment of silence. Mark tensed, his instincts kicking in. Something was approaching. Saris's posture shifted. She moved closer to Mark, her expression now alert, her hand hovering near the energy around her. "Stay close," she said, her voice low and firm. "We're not alone here." Mark nodded, glancing nervously into the jungle. The air seemed to grow thicker, and he could feel the tension building. Whatever was coming was big. He could sense it. He took a step back, but Saris was already standing tall, prepared for whatever was about to happen. The rustling grew louder, and then, emerging from the trees, came a creature unlike anything Mark had ever seen. It stood on 4 legs, its body covered in thick, spiny armor that shimmered in the low light. Its eyes glowed a brilliant blue, and its teeth were sharp, too many to count. Its presence felt like a force of nature. Mark froze. The creature locked eyes with him, and he could feel its gaze boring into him. His heart raced as he instinctively reached for the energy that had pulsed through him earlier, but it felt distant, out of reach. Ceres didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her posture unwavering. "Stay back," she warned the creature in a language Mark didn't understand. The creature growled, but it didn't move. It seemed to be studying them, its blue eyes shifting between Ceres and Mark. Mark could feel the power in the air, something ancient, something dangerous. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face it, but he knew Ceres wouldn't back down. Ceres's eyes were focused, calm, but Mark could see the hint of concern beneath her exterior. "You've just unlocked your power, Mark," she said quietly. "This is your test. You can do this." Mark swallowed, his mind racing. The creature was still staring at them, and he could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking the next step, embracing the power that was now part of him. The creature stood in front of Mark, its glowing eyes fixed on him as it growled low in its throat. Mark's breath quickened, the air thick with tension. He could feel Ceres beside him, her presence calm and steady, but he wasn't sure how to react. He had never faced anything like this before. The creature's spiny armor shimmered in the dim light, its movements slow but deliberate. It seemed to be testing them, gauging their reaction. Mark had no idea what it wanted or what it would do next. "Ceres," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What is this thing?" Ceres didn't take her eyes off the creature. "It's a guardian. It's part of the jungle's protection. It won't attack unless it feels threatened." Mark tried to steady his breathing. "How do we stop it?" "You don't," Ceres replied softly. "You must show it that you mean no harm. Let the power inside you guide you." Mark swallowed hard. The power inside him. The same energy that had surged through him when he touched the crystal. It was still there, thrumming just beneath his skin, but he wasn't sure how to use it. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt more like someone who had stumbled into a situation way beyond his control. But Ceres was right. He had unlocked something that could make all the difference. If he didn't act, the creature might turn hostile. He had to try. Mark took a deep breath, stepping forward slowly. His hands were still trembling, but he forced himself to stay calm. The creature didn't move, but its eyes remained locked on him. Mark reached out with his senses, trying to tap into the strange energy he had felt earlier. It wasn't easy. It felt like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. But he focused, imagining the power flowing through him, imagining it surrounding the creature, calming it. To his surprise, he felt a shift. The energy responded, pulsing outward, a wave of calm that seemed to reach the creature. It paused, its growl quieting. Mark continued to focus, silently willing the creature to understand that they meant no harm. Slowly, the creature's stance relaxed. It didn't lower its head, but it stopped growling. The glowing blue of its eyes softened, and the tension in the air seemed to ease. Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The creature was still there, but it wasn't a threat anymore. It wasn't a friend either, but for now, that was enough. He glanced at Ceres, who gave him a small nod of approval. "Well done," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. Mark smiled weakly. "I didn't do anything." "You did more than you think," Ceres said. "You connected with it. You used the energy inside you. That's what matters." Mark turned back to the creature, which was now standing still, its eyes calm but alert. It seemed to have accepted him, at least for the moment. Slowly, it turned and walked back into the jungle, disappearing into the shadows from where it had come. Mark exhaled, his body still tense from the encounter. That was intense. Ceres placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did well, Mark." The creature didn't attack because you showed it that you weren't a threat. You have the power to influence things around you now, to protect those who need it. Mark wasn't sure what to think. He had felt something, a connection with the creature, but it hadn't been as easy as Cirrus made it sound. The power inside him was still foreign, and he didn't feel entirely in control of it. But he had to admit, it was the first time he had used it in a way that didn't feel like an accident. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Mark confessed, rubbing the back of his neck. "What if something goes wrong? What if I lose control?" Cirrus's eyes softened. "You will get better with time. This is just the beginning, Mark. You don't have to be perfect. You just need to try. You've already proven that you can do this." Mark nodded, but doubt still lingered in his mind. It was one thing to face a creature in the jungle, but what would happen when the stakes were higher? What if the power inside him became too much to handle? "Let's move on," Cirrus said, pulling him from his thoughts. "We have a long journey ahead, and we can't afford to waste time." Mark followed her, but his mind was still spinning. The jungle around them felt less oppressive now, but it also felt more dangerous. Whatever this power was, he wasn't sure he could control it completely. And even more than that, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Cirrus led the way, her steps confident as she navigated the thick jungle. Mark stayed close behind her, his mind turning over everything that had happened. He couldn't help but feel like this was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change everything. As they walked, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into a future he didn't understand, a future he wasn't sure he was ready for. But it was happening, whether he was ready or not. And one thing was certain, he couldn't go back now. Not after everything that had happened. The power inside him, the crystal, Cirrus, it all felt like part of a larger puzzle, a puzzle he was now bound to solve. Mark didn't know where this path would lead, but he was about to find out. And whether he liked it or not, he was at the center of it all.